I've always been skeptical of the so-called weird stuff people claim happens in small towns. Sure, the isolation can get to you, and the silence makes your brain fill in the gaps with strange ideas. But ghosts, monsters, get real. That's what I thought until I spent a week in the kind of place you pass through but never stop in. Small town USA wasn't even on my radar until a friend asked me to house sit. They were spending 2 weeks in Florida, and I'd been itching for a break from city life. A cozy house with a backyard and no noisy neighbors sounded perfect. From the moment I got there, something felt off. Maybe it was how quiet the streets were. Not the kind of peaceful quiet, but that unnatural silence, where even the birds seemed to have vacated. The old man at the gas station gave me a long, squinting look when I said where I was staying, but didn't elaborate. I chalked it up to small-town paranoia. The house itself was cute. Single story, porch swing, big oak tree in the yard. But the inside was sterile, almost too clean. My friend had warned me about the overly attentive cleaning lady. She treats the place like a museum, they joked. I figured that explained the faint scent of bleach in the air and how nothing seemed out of place. The first night was uneventful. I cracked open a beer, flipped through some Netflix, and crashed early. It wasn't until the second night that things started to spiral. It was around midnight when I heard it. A scraping noise, like someone dragging something heavy across concrete. I muted the TV, straining my ears. The sound seemed to come from the backyard. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe a stray dog, so I grabbed a flashlight and went to check it out. The yard was empty. The oak tree's branches swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows across the lawn. But then I noticed something strange. A trail of scratches in the dirt, leading from the base of the tree toward the back fence. They were deep, parallel grooves, too even to be made by an animal. I told myself it had to be a prank. Some bored local kids messing with the outsider. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I decided to explore the town. If the locals were responsible for the scratches, I'd gauge their vibe. But no one wanted to talk. The few people I passed on the street avoided my eyes. The clerk at the grocery store was the only one who spoke to me, and even then, all they said was, "You should leave before the weekend." I laughed it off, but by the time I got back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the scraping noise returned, louder this time. It wasn't outside anymore, it was inside the house. The scraping wasn't coming from the backyard this time. It echoed through the house, faint but deliberate, like someone dragging a chair across a hardwood floor. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming from the basement. Now, I'm not a brave person. If this had been my place, I'd have grabbed my keys and been halfway down the highway. But it wasn't my house, and my friend had left me in charge. So, against every survival instinct I had, I grabbed a kitchen knife and made my way to the basement door. It was one of those old wooden doors with peeling paint and a lock that looked like it had been installed before electricity was a thing. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into pure darkness. My flashlight beam barely pierced the black, but I could make out the bottom step. The scraping sound had stopped, leaving the air thick with silence. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the void below. No answer. I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a draft or the house settling. Then I saw it. A faint movement at the bottom of the stairs. Just a shadow shifting, too quick to make out, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away as my heart pounded in my ears. I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was a trick of the light. But when I turned back toward the living room, I froze. Every cabinet in the kitchen was open. I hadn't heard a sound. I'd just been there, and everything had been fine. Now, dishes and glasses were arranged neatly on the counter, like someone had taken the time to carefully remove them. The open cabinets looked like gaping mouths, the silence of the house suddenly deafening. I bolted to my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed with my knife clutched tight. Sleep was out of the question. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. For a brief moment, I thought it had all been a bad dream. Then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, coming from above me. Above. The attic. I hadn't been up there yet, hadn't even thought about it. But someone or something was moving around up there. My pulse raced as I crept into the hallway, staring at the attic hatch. It was one of those old pull-down ladders, and the rope dangled slightly, as if it had been used recently. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and never come back. But my friend's face flashed in my mind. They trusted me. If I abandoned the place, what would happen to them? Gripping the knife tighter, I reached for the rope and pulled. The ladder unfolded with a groan, revealing a dark square above me. Dust floated down like tiny ghosts, illuminated by the morning light. I hesitated, then climbed, each step creaking under my weight. The attic smelled old, like dry rot and forgotten things. My flashlight swept across the space, revealing stacks of boxes, old furniture, and a chair. It was in the center of the attic, facing away from me. The scraping noise. I stepped closer, heart hammering in my chest. As I rounded the chair, I saw it. An old porcelain doll sitting upright, its head tilted toward me. Its face was cracked, one glass eye missing, the other staring directly into mine. That's when I heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely audible, but it came from the doll. Said my name. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the faint whisper repeated my name. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft, childlike, and unnatural, like it was coming from somewhere far away and up close all at once. The doll didn't move, but its single glass eye seemed to track me as I backed away. My flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering across the attic. In the dim light, the shadows seemed to writhe, stretching toward me like oily fingers. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then, the whisper turned into a low giggle. It wasn't just the doll anymore. The sound came from all around me, echoing in the enclosed space. I snapped out of my stupor and bolted for the ladder, nearly tripping in my panic. The giggling followed me, growing louder, overlapping with itself like a crowd of unseen voices. When I hit the floor, I slammed the attic hatch shut and twisted the lock. My breathing was ragged, my chest heaving as I stumbled back against the wall. Then the scratching started. It came from the other side of the attic hatch, slow and deliberate. It sounded like nails or claws, dragging across the wood. The sound sent chills rippling across my skin. I had to get out of the house. Now, grabbing my keys and phone, I rushed for the front door. But when I reached it, I stopped dead. The scratches from the attic weren't the only ones. Deep, parallel grooves were gouged into the front door, fresh and splintered. They weren't there before. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. I didn't know if I was running toward safety or into something worse, but I didn't care. The door creaked open, revealing the bright, sunlit yard. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The oak tree in the yard, the one that had seemed so harmless when I arrived, now had something hanging from its lowest branch. A doll. Not the porcelain one from the attic, but something cruder, stitched together from burlap and twine. Its head was lopsided, and its black button eyes stared blankly at me. It swayed gently in the breeze, as if mocking my fear. Behind me, the scratching at the attic hatch turned to pounding. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as my vision blurred with panic. The engine sputtered to life, and I peeled out of the driveway, leaving the house, and whatever was inside it, behind. But as I drove through the empty streets of the town, my stomach sank. Every yard I passed had one of those burlap dolls hanging from a tree or a fence post, all of them swaying gently in the same rhythm. And in the rearview mirror, I saw the attic hatch burst open. A shadowed figure climbed onto the roof of the house, its shape wrong. Too tall, too thin, and too bent. It turned toward me, though I couldn't make out a face. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. Even then, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever had happened in small town was behind me. But then I found a scratch, a deep, parallel groove, on the outside of my apartment door, and hanging from my balcony railing was a burlap doll. This one had my name stitched into its chest. I slammed the door shut and locked every bolt, my heart racing like a runaway train. My apartment had always been my sanctuary, but now it felt like a trap. The burlap doll swung gently in the wind outside, its stitched smile mocking me through the glass of the balcony door. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't leave it there. Grabbing a kitchen towel to avoid direct contact, I stepped onto the balcony. The air felt wrong, heavy, almost electric, like a thunderstorm was brewing. The doll was smaller up close, no bigger than a child's teddy bear. Its button eyes glinted in the fading sunlight, and its body swayed in an unnatural rhythm, as though it had a heartbeat. I reached out with the towel, but the moment I touched it, a voice whispered my name again. "Don't look away." I froze. The whisper came from the doll. My instinct screamed to drop it and run, but my body didn't obey. Slowly, the stitched smile began to move, the burlap stretching unnaturally as the whisper turned into a sinister chuckle. And then it started speaking. "They'll come for you tonight." I threw the doll off the balcony. It tumbled through the air and hit the pavement below, but it didn't stop laughing. The sound rose, distorted and inhuman, echoing up the side of the building. Slamming the balcony door shut, I drew the blinds and backed away, clutching my phone. I needed help. Someone. Anyone. I called my friend, the one whose house I'd been watching. The line rang 3 times before they picked up. "What's wrong?" they asked, their voice groggy and distant. "I need to know," I stammered. "Has anything strange ever happened at your house?" There was a long pause. "What do you mean?" "The attic," I said. "The scratches. The doll. What the hell is going on?" Their breathing quickened. "You weren't supposed to go in the attic." "I didn't have a choice," I shouted. "There's something in your house, and now it's here, in my apartment." The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the call wouldn't connect. The laughter outside had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. And then, a knock at the door. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that demands attention. I didn't move. My apartment was on the 5th floor, and I hadn't buzzed anyone in. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. No answer. Summoning what little courage I had left, I crept to the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the figure from the house, the tall, bent shadow that had climbed onto the roof. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its face hidden by darkness, but I could feel its gaze burning through the door. It raised a long, spindly hand and raked its claws down the wood, leaving fresh gouges next to the peephole. I stumbled back, clutching the knife I'd grabbed from the kitchen. My mind raced. What did it want? The lights flickered, plunging the apartment into darkness. Then I heard it. The attic hatch, the one I didn't have. It creaked open somewhere above me, and a soft, scraping sound began. Faint at first, but growing louder, closer, like something crawling through the walls. A voice echoed in the darkness, the same whisper that had haunted me since small town. "Don't look away." I turned toward the sound, and there it was. The burlap doll sat on my coffee table, its button eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its stitched mouth opened wide, and out crawled a hand, thin, gnarled, and impossibly long. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was the hand reaching for me, and the whisper turning into a roar. When I woke up, the apartment was empty. The door was intact, the scratches gone. Even the doll had disappeared. But on the floor, scrawled in deep gouges, were 3 words. "They're watching you." I didn't leave my apartment for 2 days. I kept every light on, every door locked, and every curtain drawn. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, an oppressive weight pressing on me no matter where I went. Every sound made me jump. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, even my own breath. The scratches on my front door might have disappeared, but I could still feel their presence. On the 3rd day, I finally snapped. Sitting in the suffocating silence of my apartment, I realized I couldn't just sit there and wait for something to happen. I had to take control. I packed a bag, grabbed my car keys, and bolted. My plan was simple. Get out of the city, head somewhere far away, and figure out what to do next. The drive was tense. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see the shadowy figure or those cursed burlap dolls staring back at me. But the road behind me was empty. I drove for hours, through winding back roads and stretches of empty highway, until I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of nowhere. It wasn't much. A dingy room with peeling wallpaper and a bed that smelled faintly of mildew. But it was far from small town, and that was good enough for me. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Until I saw the doll. It was sitting on the nightstand when I turned on the light. The same burlap creation, its button eyes glinting in the dim glow of the lamp. This time it wasn't alone. There were dozens of them scattered across the room, on the bed, the dresser, the floor. Some were small enough to fit in my hand, while others were nearly life-sized. They all faced me, their stitched mouths twisted into sinister grins. I backed toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. Then the whispering started. A cacophony of voices filled the room, overlapping in a chilling harmony. My name echoed from every corner, growing louder and more frantic. I clamped my hands over my ears and screamed, but it did nothing to drown out the sound. The dolls began to move, their heads jerking toward me in unison. One by one, they stood. Their movements were slow, puppet-like, as they shuffled toward me. The largest doll reached out with its stitched hands, its grin stretching wider. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran for the bathroom. Slamming the door shut, I locked it and pressed my back against it, struggling to catch my breath. The whispering continued, muffled but relentless, as the dolls scratched and pounded against the other side of the door. And then silence. I didn't trust it. My body trembled as I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement. The whisper came again, but this time, it was right behind me. "Don't look away." I turned, and there it was, the porcelain doll from the attic, perched on the edge of the bathtub. Its single glass eye seemed to pierce through me, its cracked face twisting into something almost alive. Before I could react, the light flickered and went out, plunging the bathroom into total darkness. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. And then I saw them, not with my eyes, but in my mind, dozens of shadowy figures, their bent and broken forms crowding the small bathroom, their clawed hands reaching for me. I screamed, flailing in the dark, but there was nowhere to go. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the voices rose to a crescendo. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the bathroom was empty. No dolls, no scratches, just me, sitting on the cold tile floor, shaking. But when I looked in the mirror, my reflection wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was stitched together with burlap. I stumbled back from the mirror, my legs giving out beneath me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the thing in the glass. Its burlap face twisted into a grotesque mockery of mine, the stitched smile spreading wider the longer I looked. I reached up to touch my face, desperate to prove it was still mine, but the reflection didn't follow. Its hand stayed pressed against the glass, the button eyes glinting with something dark and knowing. "Let me out," it whispered. "No," I choked, my voice barely audible. The reflection tilted its head, the stitches on its face tightening. "You don't have a choice." The bathroom door slammed open, and I screamed. But when I turned, the hallway beyond was empty. No dolls, no shadows, just the dim, flickering light of the motel room. I hesitated, then bolted. I didn't care where I was going, only that I had to get out. The motel room was a minefield of overturned furniture and scattered objects, as if something had torn through it while I was in the bathroom. The burlap dolls were gone. But as I reached the front door, I heard the whisper again. "You can't leave." The air grew cold, so cold I could see my breath. The room darkened, the shadows lengthening unnaturally. And then I saw them, lining the walls, standing in the corners. The dolls were back, but they were moving now. Their heads turned to follow me, their button eyes glinting in the darkness. I flung the door open and ran into the night, not stopping to look back. The motel parking lot was empty, my car sitting under a lone, flickering streetlight. I dove inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot. The road stretched out before me, empty and endless, but I didn't care. I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. It wasn't until I'd been driving for over an hour that I noticed the scratches. They were on the inside of the windshield, long parallel grooves that hadn't been there before. My breath hitched as I stared at them, my stomach sinking. Then I saw the doll. It was sitting in the passenger seat, small and unassuming, with its stitched smile and button eyes. "How long are you going to run?" it asked, its voice low and mocking. I screamed, swerving the car off the road. The tires skidded on loose gravel, and I came to a stop inches from a tree. When I looked back at the seat, the doll was gone. But the whisper wasn't. "You can't escape," it said, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You're one of us now." "No," I shouted, slamming my hands against the wheel. "I'm not like you." The whisper grew louder, overlapping with itself until it became a roar. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning as the sound filled my head. And then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in small town. The oak tree stood in the yard, its branches heavy with burlap dolls. The house loomed before me, dark and uninviting, the attic window glowing faintly. My car was gone, the road behind me swallowed by darkness. I stumbled toward the house, unable to stop myself. The front door creaked open on its own, revealing the same sterile, too clean interior. The whispers were everywhere now, coming from the walls, the floor, the air itself. And at the foot of the attic ladder stood the porcelain doll. Its cracked face twisted into a smile as it raised one hand and pointed up. I didn't want to climb. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me to the ladder. The attic was waiting. As I climbed, the whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single, chilling command. Become. At the top, the chair was still there, but it wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped in it, its body covered in burlap, its button eyes staring blankly ahead. It was me. The last thing I remember was the doll's voice, soft and final. Don't look away. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The room was normal, no scratches, no dolls. But when I looked in the mirror, my face was still mine. At least it looked like it. But sometimes, when the light catches my reflection just right, I see it. The faint outline of stitches and the glint of button eyes staring back at me. Weeks passed, but life never truly returned to normal. The whispers had stopped, the scratches didn't reappear, and there were no dolls in sight. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. At first, I told myself it was paranoia. After everything I'd been through, who wouldn't feel on edge? But then I started noticing the little things. The way my reflection seemed to linger a second too long when I walked past mirrors, the faint sound of fabric rustling in empty rooms, and the dreams. Every night, I found myself back in the attic, standing before the stitched version of myself. Its button eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its stitched mouth opened wide, whispering the same word over and over. Join. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, only to find the apartment silent and still. But the dreams weren't the worst part. It was the shadows. At first, I thought they were tricks of the light, shapes shifting in the corner of my eye, disappearing when I turned to look. But they grew bolder. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw it clearly. In the bathroom mirror, just behind me, a figure stood in the shadows, tall, bent, and wrong. Its face was obscured, but its hands, those long, gnarled claws, reached out toward me. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I started avoiding mirrors entirely, covering them with towels and sheets. But the shadows followed me. They crept along the walls and ceiling, growing darker, more distinct. One night, I decided to confront them. Armed with a flashlight and the knife I'd kept since small town, I waited. The shadows pooled in the corner of the living room, their edges shifting like smoke. What do you want? I shouted, my voice trembling. The room fell silent. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a voice came from the darkness, low and rasping. It's too late. The shadows surged forward, swallowing the light. I stumbled back, swinging the knife blindly, but it was useless. The darkness enveloped me, cold and suffocating. And then I was back in small town. The oak tree loomed before me, its branches heavy with dolls. The house stood silent and waiting, the attic window glowing faintly. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked up the steps, the front door creaking open as I approached. The interior was the same, sterile, too clean, and filled with that faint smell of bleach. The attic ladder was already down. As I climbed, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Become. At the top, the stitched version of myself was waiting. It stood now, its button eyes locking onto mine. Its stitched mouth moved, forming words I couldn't understand. But I felt them. I felt the pull, the weight of its gaze, the irresistible urge to step forward. No, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I'm not like you. The stitched figure tilted its head, its button eyes narrowing. The whispers grew deafening, filling my mind, drowning out my thoughts. And then it lunged. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was in my apartment. The shadows were gone, the mirrors uncovered. Everything seemed normal, but I knew better. When I stepped outside, the world felt different. People looked at me strangely, their eyes lingering just a second too long. I heard whispers in places that should have been silent, felt unseen eyes watching my every move. And when I looked in the mirror, I finally understood. The face staring back at me wasn't mine anymore. It was stitched, and somewhere, deep in the reflection, the real me was screaming. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the stitched reflection. Its button eyes gleamed with a knowing malice, its stitched mouth curling into a slow, deliberate grin. My heart pounded as a terrifying realization washed over me. I wasn't in control anymore. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking the movements of the stitched figure from the attic. My hands shook as I raised them to my face, desperate to feel the skin that I wasn't sure was still there. Felt normal. But in the mirror, the stitches ran deep, crisscrossing my face like a macabre tapestry. My fingers trembled as I touched my cheeks, my jaw, my lips. I couldn't feel the thread, but I could see it, mocking me in the glass. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised one stitched hand and pointed behind me. I spun around, expecting shadows, whispers, or worse. But the apartment was empty. Then I saw it. The doll. It sat in the middle of the living room floor, perfectly still, its burlap face tilted upward as though it were watching me. Its stitched mouth hung slightly open, and something glinted inside. Something small, metallic, and impossibly familiar. A key. I didn't want to approach it. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to burn the doll, to destroy it. But something about the key drew me closer, like an invisible thread pulling me in. When I reached the doll, I crouched down, hesitating before I touched it. Its button eyes seemed to follow my movements, and I swore I saw its mouth twitch. With trembling hands, I grabbed the key. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the instant it left the doll's mouth, the whispers started again. "Come back," they said. "Come home." I looked around, panicked, but the apartment remained still. The whispers didn't come from the walls or the air this time. They came from inside me. My head throbbed as the voices grew louder, overlapping, repeating the same chilling phrase. "Come home." I didn't understand. Home? Did they mean small town? The key in my hand was old, its surface worn and rusted. There was no indication of what it unlocked, but deep down I knew it wasn't over. The next day, I got in my car and drove. I didn't pack anything or tell anyone where I was going. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting to the place where this nightmare had started. Small town. The streets were as empty as I remembered, the air thick with that same unnatural silence. The oak tree stood in the yard, its branches bare now, the doll's gone. The house loomed ahead, dark and waiting. This time, the front door was locked. I stared at it for a moment, the key heavy in my hand. My breath fogged in the cold air as I slid the key into the lock and turned. The door creaked open, revealing the same sterile interior. But now, the house felt alive, its walls humming with an energy I couldn't see. The attic ladder was down, just as it had been before. My steps were slow, deliberate as I climbed. The whispers grew louder with each rung, their voices blending into a single, haunting melody. At the top, the attic was empty. No chair, no dolls, no stitched version of myself. Just a single, ornate mirror standing in the center of the room. Its surface shimmered, and as I approached, I saw my reflection. It wasn't stitched. It wasn't the grotesque version I'd seen before. It was me, but it wasn't moving. I reached out, my hand trembling as it met the glass. It was warm to the touch, almost alive. My reflection stared back at me, its eyes filled with fear. "Help me," it whispered. Before I could react, the glass rippled like water, and something reached out from the other side. A hand. Stitched, gnarled, and clawed, wrapped around my wrist, pulling me toward the mirror. I screamed, struggling against its grip, but it was too strong. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my reflection. Now free, stepping out of the mirror, smiled, and then I was gone. If you're reading this, it means the stitched version of me is still out there, walking around in my skin. It looks like me, talks like me, lives like me, but it isn't me. And if you ever find a burlap doll, a scratched door, or a whisper that calls your name, run. When I came to, the world was dim and warped. Shadows stretched unnaturally across a colorless void, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was underwater. I wasn't in the attic anymore. I stood on a floor that wasn't a floor, a swirling expanse of black fabric that shifted under my weight. Around me, tall, gnarled figures loomed, their burlap faces stitched with malevolent grins. Button eyes stared down, unblinking, reflecting a distorted version of myself. The whispers were everywhere now, a chorus of voices that crawled into my skull and nested there. "Welcome home," they said. "No," I muttered, my voice weak and trembling. "This isn't real." The figures laughed, their stitched mouths opening wider, revealing jagged, thread-like teeth. "It's real enough," one of them said, stepping closer. Its movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. "And you belong here now." I backed away, but the fabric beneath me seemed to pull me forward, threads coiling around my ankles. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move. "I don't belong here," I said, louder this time. "You made a mistake." The figures tilted their heads in unison, their button eyes glinting. "No mistake," the tallest one said. "You took the key. You opened the door. You invited us in." The memory of the key flashed in my mind, cold and rusted in my hand. The whispers, the mirror, my reflection stepping out. "That wasn't me," I shouted. "That thing, my reflection. It tricked me." They laughed again, a sound that made my skin crawl. "All reflections are true," another said. "It's you who lied." The threads tightened, pulling me to my knees. The fabric beneath me rippled, and I realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was a mass of burlap dolls, their stitched hands clawing at me, their button eyes glowing with faint light. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I just want to go home." "This is your home now," the tallest figure said, leaning down until its face was inches from mine. I could see every thread, every imperfect stitch that held it together. Its breath smelled of rot and old wood. "No," I said again, my voice shaking but defiant. "This isn't my home. It's yours." The figure paused, tilting its head. The whispers faltered, replaced by a tense silence. I didn't know where the words came from, but they spilled out of me, raw and desperate. "You don't belong in my world, just like I don't belong in yours. That's why you need us. You're nothing without us." The tallest figure straightened, its button eyes narrowing. "We don't need you," it hissed. "Then why keep me here?" I said, forcing myself to stand despite the threads pulling at me. "If you don't need me, let me go." The figures exchanged glances, their movements stiff and unnatural. The whispers returned, quieter this time, like they were arguing amongst themselves. Finally, the tallest one spoke. "If you leave," it said, "you will always carry us with you. You will see us in every shadow, hear us in every silence. You will never escape." "Fine," I said, my voice firm. "I'll take my chances." The figure stared at me for a long moment. Then, with a flick of its clawed hand, the threads unraveled, and I fell through the void. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my apartment. The light outside was harsh, almost blinding, and the air smelled clean and fresh. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it was over, but then I saw it, the smallest, faintest scratch on the edge of my coffee table. And when I looked in the mirror, my reflection smiled, just a little too wide. I've been running ever since. No matter where I go, the signs follow. Scratches, whispers, shadows that don't quite match the light. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I see the burlap dolls. They never move, but they're always there, just out of reach, watching. So if you ever see a stitched shadow in the corner of your eye, or hear a whisper that knows your name, don't look away, because they're always watching, and they never let go. I thought I could outrun them. I moved across states, changed my name, burned every possession tied to that house in small town. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many layers of my life I stripped away, they always found me. The scratches appeared first, small, unassuming, on the edges of furniture, door frames, and even my skin. I'd wake up with thin, parallel lines on my arms or legs, faint but unmistakable. Then came the whispers, soft and fleeting, like someone murmuring just behind me. But the worst were the dolls. At first, they were subtle. A burlap figure tucked into the corner of a motel room. A crude, stitched face staring at me from a park bench. Once, I found one dangling from the rearview mirror of my car, its button eyes reflecting my own terrified gaze. Each time, I destroyed them. I burned them, tore them apart, threw them into rivers. But they always came back. It wasn't until I saw the first person change that I realized I wasn't just running from them anymore. I was leading them to others. It happened in a diner somewhere in the Midwest. I'd stopped for coffee, trying to calm my nerves after another sleepless night. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, brought me my order. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice warm with concern. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As she walked away, I noticed it. A small burlap doll tucked into the pocket of her apron. My stomach dropped. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. "Where did you get that?" She looked confused, pulling the doll from her pocket. "This? Someone left it on the counter this morning," she said, holding it up. "I thought it was cute." "No," I said, standing abruptly. "It's not. You need to get rid of it. Right now." Her smile faltered, and she took a step back. "Sir, it's just a doll." "It's not just a doll," I shouted, drawing the attention of the other patrons. "Please, you have to trust me. Burn it, throw it away, anything. Just don't keep it." The woman looked at me like I was insane, clutching the doll to her chest. "Maybe you should leave," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to argue, to grab the doll and destroy it myself, but the whispers started before I could move. They filled the diner, soft and insistent, weaving between the conversations and the clatter of dishes. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy. The woman froze, her eyes widening in fear. Slowly, her head turned toward me, and I saw it. Her pupils shrinking to pinpoints, her mouth curling into an unnatural grin. "Don't look away," she whispered, her voice not her own. The doll in her hands twisted and writhed, its button eyes glowing faintly. I ran. Now, I don't stay anywhere for more than a night. I avoid people, refuse to make connections. I can't let them spread this to anyone else. But the whispers are getting louder. The scratches appear faster, deeper. And last night, I saw my reflection in a window. It wasn't stitched anymore. It wasn't even me. It was the tall, bent figure from small town, its button eyes watching me with a terrible, silent hunger. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. If you've made it this far, consider this my final warning. They're not just watching, they're waiting. And when they come for you, there's no escape. I'm done running. I can't keep dragging this nightmare with me, leaving scratches and whispers in my wake for others to find. These things, they've followed me long enough. They've burrowed into my life, my mind, and my soul. And now they want to take everything. But I'm not going down without a fight. I started researching, digging into old stories about small town, about cursed objects, about anything that could explain what I'm dealing with. There wasn't much, but what I did find pointed to one thing. The dolls weren't just manifestations of the curse. They were anchors, tethering the darkness to our world. Destroying them wasn't enough. If I wanted to end this, I had to break the connection at its source. The key. I'd thrown it into a river weeks ago, desperate to rid myself of anything tied to small town. But last night, I woke up to find it on my nightstand, gleaming in the moonlight. It wasn't just a key, it was an invitation. So now I'm going back. The drive to small town felt different this time. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the landscape seemed to warp around me. The trees along the highway twisted in on themselves, their shadows stretching like clawed hands. The radio crackled with faint whispers, overlapping voices that grew louder the closer I got. By the time I reached the oak tree, the sun had vanished, swallowed by thick, unnatural clouds. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. The front door was already open. I stepped inside, the key cold in my hand. The house was alive now, its walls pulsing with dark energy. The attic ladder was down, waiting for me. As I climbed, the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. The attic was the same as before, the swirling void stretching infinitely in every direction. And at the center of it all was the mirror. This time, the reflection didn't hesitate. It stepped out as soon as I approached, its stitched face grinning, its button eyes glowing faintly. Behind it, the tall, bent figures emerged from the shadows, their gnarled hands reaching toward me. "You shouldn't have come back," the reflection said, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "Maybe," I said, holding up the key. "But I'm not leaving." The figures stopped, their movements faltering. The reflection's grin faded, its button eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop this?" it hissed. "You're nothing, just another thread in the weave." "Maybe," I said again, "but every thread can be unraveled." Before it could react, I plunged the key into the mirror. The glass shattered, and the world around me erupted into